Chapter 6 Victory Without Prayer. Whenever I walked the wide, new streets of Stalingrad, the miracle of the city's rebirth could not be hidden, destroyed down to the last building, reduced to powdered brick and tangled steel by the full force of Hitler's might. Stalingrad is today once more a leading industrial center with a will to live. Its population of over 500,000 is predominantly employed in tractor and steel plants, canning factories, oil refineries, and shipyards. Northward is the great new Volga River Dam, 3 miles wide, carrying a superhighway and a railroad right-of-way across its top. This is the most gigantic hydroelectric project in the Eastern world. Only the parks of rest and culture and the broad open esplanade along the Volga betray the tragic past. Everyone knows that thousands of dead lie buried here, as in Kharkov and Kiev, and 100 other cities. War's victims were buried in mass. In the first German air raid against the city, 175,000 citizens of Stalingrad were wiped out. Altogether, Russia lost 7.5 million soldiers in the defense of the motherland. 2.5 million more persons died of hunger, and millions more were maimed. The bloodiest of battles was Stalingrad. The turning point of the war was here in this city. Hitler called it a walled fortress and a red Verdun. He once issued the premature report that Stalingrad had fallen. The Soviets responded with a pledge: there is no land beyond the Volga. There is no road of retreat. No sacrifice is now too dear for us, and deathless courage is our only cause. I went out early one morning to find a Catholic church, where I had been told Mass was being observed. The full force of a people's determination to outlive the past was apparent at this sunrise hour. All around me, workers were going forth to meet the destiny of another day. Against the walls of newly constructed buildings, 2- and 3-story high posters reminded them of the glory of the Soviet system and urged them to build bigger and greater than ever before, to raise more crops, better cattle, larger dairy herds. Radio loudspeakers recounted statistics on growth and achievement. Who could escape the hypnotic pressure of this promotional technique? It goes on everywhere in Russia, practically day and night. Caught in it, I could not help but feel the burden as well as the spirit of these people. Any American looking into the store windows would conclude that these people, in Stalingrad particularly, have nothing to live for but work, nothing to look forward to but hope, nothing to expect of life but the unending command to build. Store windows displayed the kind of clothing and wares that we associate with our 5- and 10-cent counters and our dollar stores. Shoes, clothing, appliances are scarce, expensive, and annoyingly impractical from our point of view, and always the incessant march of the workers and the chant of the loudspeakers tell you that life is regimented, life is hard. But as I walked in search of the chapel, I realized again that we in America have no cities where the parks are cemeteries, and where life was once bombed down to barren dust. We have been spared. To us much has been given of us much is expected, and part of what is expected is tolerance and understanding and compassion. Many Russians have the feeling, and rightly, that their problems are more difficult than ours, their lives harder to live, their circumstances vastly different from those we know. I paused to inquire about directions from a building custodian who knew fragments of English. He took time to walk with me 5 long, open blocks. In appreciation, I gave him an English missal, which an American friend had given me. He was thrilled with it, patted it affectionately, and said, "I would like it, but it is too much. Anyway, I am not Catholic." "Keep it," I said with a laugh. "Neither am I." "I am a non-believer," he replied, then added, "Well, almost a non-believer." "Almost a non-believer," I told him, "is almost a believer." He laughed at this and decided to keep the missal as his first gift from an American. Lorena's reminder that he who comes to Stalingrad without faith will find it here came back to me as I joined the worshippers. There were not more than 30, but the spirit of devotion was real, and there was also a certain sense of freedom, more than I had found in many other churches, along the way of our research. Finding faith in Stalingrad is not too difficult. The historic battle line is memorialized with monuments of cannon, the bombed-out house, and the gutted mill, where the victory or death order was issued, are shrines. Here the miracle offensive was born, up on a lonely hill. A single tank marks the spot where the Battle of Liberation began, and where the pick of the Nazi forces were sealed off, crushed and killed inside the Soviet ring. My guide, a girl from Intourist, intimated that once it would have been impossible to walk here without stepping on the dead. Ever since the war's end, Russian borders have been clearing away the shells and shrapnel and shattered war material from these battlefields. But all one needs to do is scrape the ground to find layer upon layer of additional fragments, to say nothing of pieces of human bone. Lorena took many pictures here, particularly of the women workers who were constructing high new walls and shaping the chalk-white stones with expert skill. Our guide said that right where we stood, the spirit of the new Russian has been born. Another interpreter with whom I talked about the siege of Stalingrad had his own idea about it. He called it victory without prayer. He attributed the triumph to faith, but he meant faith that had stopped counting the cost or the dead. He meant faith in Tommy guns and sniper rifles, in hand grenades and mortars, faith in a Zhukov, a Rokossovsky, a Yeremenko, and a Stalin. He called it faith in time, time which held back the Hitler terror for 5 months and 4 days, through one of Russia's fiercest winters, against one of Russia's bitterest foes. But he did not mind if someone, I for instance, for sentimental reasons, wanted to believe it might also have been faith in God. That was one man's point of view. There were many who agreed with him, but in Stalingrad I also found another man, a teacher with a different idea. He had his own explanation of the victory at Stalingrad. He said the dead were praying. I first met this elderly teacher by chance in the Memorial Museum, where maps, miniature war models, and dioramas tell the graphic story of the 149 days that saved the world. Here, in these surroundings, he explained what he meant by the praying dead. According to his estimate, These were men who once reflected the soul of Russia, a soul greater than that of church or state, a soul immortalized in the quest for God. He was thinking of Russian saints, though not in the ecclesiastical or orthodox sense. He meant men like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Berdyaev. These were the dead who were praying for Russia's salvation. These were the ones whose spirits returned to help and inspire the people who saved the city. He felt that the power of these immortal dead had reached out in a mystical way to turn the tide of battle, and that today they were making a strong bid to lead the Russian masses back to God. The teacher was neither a churchman nor a spiritualist. He was simply one who felt that communism's greatest mistake was its rejection of God, its greatest sin, denial of the immortality of the human soul, its greatest folly, an attempt to thwart the religious impulse. But for these mortal errors, Russia could have gone on from the victory at Stalingrad to conquer the world without a struggle. So he believed. This man was one of my most interesting discoveries. Did he represent a widespread, unvoiced opinion? Were there many like him, I wondered, who held these views? For here was a Russian who, in the very heart of the atheistic experiment, was willing to testify that the universe not only had meaning and intelligence, that life was not only purposive, but according to him, death was an extension of life, and the departed were active in the affairs of the living. He was of the opinion that many communists secretly believed these things, but were afraid to admit them. Afraid of what? Of other communists. Afraid of the status quo. Communism is very strange, he said. The words and power of Lenin are still very subtle and very real. There is fear of Lenin even today, though the man died shortly after the revolution. This too is part of the mysticism in Russian life. No one, the teacher insisted, lives apart from the past, and this must be understood in order to understand Russia. No one is unrelated to the unseen and the spiritual world, be it good or evil. Every man is potentially a captive of the unseen powers to which he commits himself. Every Russian reflects the nature of his commitment and the source of his strength. When he suggested that someday a spiritual prophet might arise in the land, a man who would effect a powerful influence upon the nation, I asked whether this could actually happen under the communist regime. Would not any prophet or saint immediately be put down? Wouldn't his fate be Siberia or death? Our leaders may appear ruthless and bold, he ventured, but they are not insensible to world opinion. I could not agree. I reminded him of Poland and Hungary. He felt there were conditions and problems in these countries which no one but communist officials fully understood. He believed there was more freedom and more tolerance and more intelligent leadership in Russia now than he had seen in his 50-odd years. I wondered whether even he, fearless and extraordinary though he might be, was instinctively cautious not to offend his Russian masters. He always came back to the people. He felt it was the lack of a united voice among the people that caused the government to follow courses which might be contrary to the people's will. He contended that more churches would be open today if the people demanded them. More priests would be trained if the people insisted upon it. He always returned to his thesis that Russia lacks heroic men among the masses. The truly great of Russia are the living dead, and the living dead are praying, he repeated. Some day their prayers will be heard and answered as they were answered at the victory of Stalingrad. I met the teacher a number of times. I never learned what he was a teacher of, nor did it matter. In a world where science is king, who boasts about philosophy? Here was a lowly subject, who had his examples of the power of the praying dead, and was eager to share them with me. He assumed that everyone in America had surely heard of Fyodor Dostoevsky, had read such books as the brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, and The Possessed. Surely everyone agreed that Dostoevsky was one of the world's greatest interpreters of man's search for God. Communists had not rejected Dostoevsky. The teacher explained. Naturally, they had no sympathy for his subservience to the Romanovs, and they did not like what he said about revolutionaries, but they knew that his contribution to philosophy and literature was immortal. Talk to a communist about Shakespeare or Voltaire, and the answer would be, "We have Dostoevsky." That would even match him with a St. Paul or a St. Francis, knowing full well that a greater spiritual figure than Dostoevsky would be hard to find. Dostoevsky, he wanted me to understand, was neither monarchist nor revolutionist. He was a symbol of the Russian spirit, groping its way to freedom. That was why this writer was being referred to more and more in Russia. He was a growing power and a guide in the slow but forward-moving search for faith. Dostoevsky's prayers were beginning to reach out to the people in spite of the communist web, or perhaps because of it. Did I know that Dostoevsky had been a friend of the Romanovs only because he hoped to influence the rulers to allow the peasants more liberty? Did I realize that Dostoevsky's friendship with the mid-19th century revolutionist was for the same reason? Dostoevsky had the people at heart. He was searching for freedom for himself and for others. That was why he joined Petrashevsky's political party. That was why he was arrested and condemned to death. Had I ever read how, at the appointed time for the execution 3 days before Christmas in 1849, Dostoevsky was led to the black-draped scaffold in St. Petersburg, Semenov Square, did I know that at the very last moment, when he was being tied to the stake, when the firing squad had already filed in, an order came from Nicholas I calling for his reprieve. It was a plot. It was the Tsar's way of torturing their victim. People who talk about the cruelty of the communists have forgotten about the cruelty of the Tsars. Dostoevsky's reprieve was worse than death. On Christmas Eve he was led in chains past his home, so close that he could see the candles on the family tree, but he was not allowed to stop. Instead, he was carried off to Siberia to begin a sentence of 4 years of hard labor, 4 years in which the 10-pound weights were never removed from his legs, even though he was a sick man, an epileptic, often at the point of death. Then followed 5 more years of exile, but every Russian knew that Dostoevsky discovered God in suffering and Christ in pain, and that was something modern Russia was beginning to understand, for Fyodor Dostoevsky had once been an atheist, just as the modern Russian masses were now assumed to be. And Dostoevsky had his struggle with the unpredictable unknown, and he had his unanswered questions about the mercy and love which simple souls ascribe to God, just as Russians have their questions about these things today. The unwarranted suffering which often befell innocent people shook Dostoevsky's faith. He could not reconcile human suffering and divine compassion. His own afflictions were beyond reconciliation. Every time an epileptic paroxysm struck him, he died 1,000 deaths. For days during the aftermath, he was unable to remember where or who he was. Once when an attack seized him, he said, "I lay in the street like a whipped dog." He also suffered from poverty and hunger, and was continually haunted by the terror of his execution and imprisonment. He is like Russia, the teacher declared. That is why he is so important for us today. We see ourselves in him. The nation's life today is like his life. We too have chains around our legs, but they cannot hold us. I am not talking about revolt or bloodshed. I am talking about the spirit, the liberation of the spirit. That is what Dostoevsky is talking about. The powerful character he created in Mitya Karamazov is himself. Mitya is Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky is Russia. Like Mitya, Dostoevsky finally rose from the purgatory of doubt by the grace of God, whom he had condemned. On his way to prison, a woman had thrust a Bible into his hands. At first, it was only another burden, another weight to be added to those which his accusers had fastened on his arms and legs. But in prison he began to read and search its pages, and whenever he did, he returned to the book of Job, to live through the calamities and furies of the man of Uz, the incredible symbol of patience, who, in his moments of torment, said, "Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" At the turning of every page, Dostoevsky saw the story of his own life. In chapter after chapter, he found himself. The book became the angel that guided him out of his prison of doubt. He let Mitya say it for him. The thought of God is tormenting me. That's the thing that's worrying me. What if he doesn't exist? What if he is an idea made up by man? Then man is the chief of the earth, of the universe, magnificent. Only how is he going to be good without God? That's the question. I always come back to that. For whom is man going to love then? To whom will he be thankful? To whom will he sing the hymn? The longing for God was a great thing. Goodness, to Dostoevsky, was more than moral or ethical goodness. It was a capacity for the search of God and the courage to follow it. Today, according to the teacher, Dostoevsky's influence upon the USSR is becoming incalculable. Nothing can hold it back. Few can escape its inspiration and appeal. Neither communism nor atheism can withstand the mystical power of the living dead. Dostoevsky is returning Russia to God, as surely as God returned to him in his prison camp. It was an interesting speculation, this thought of the dead bringing a victory of arms to Stalingrad, and now a victory of the spirit to the Russian nation. Did not we in America have our mystical guardians too? Didn't we like to think that the spirit of a Washington, a Lincoln, a Jefferson, a Franklin, a Whitman watched over our country and influenced our destiny? Who was I to say these men were not calling us back to our old ideals, or leading us forward to new activities of mind and will? Who was I to question that Dostoevsky would be unable or unwilling to divinize the Russia of tomorrow? It was Dostoevsky who said, "Nations are built up and moved by the power of the persistent search for God." It was Dostoevsky who contended that socialism is not merely the labor question. It is before all things the atheistic question, the question of the Tower of Babel built without God, not to mount to heaven from earth, but to set heaven down on earth. It was Dostoevsky who cried out in tears, "What should I be underground without God? If they drive God from the earth, we shall shelter him underground." One cannot exist in prison without God. It's even more impossible than out of prison. And we men underground will sing from the bowels of the earth a glorious hymn to God, with whom is joy. Hail to God and his joy, I love him. When Dostoevsky died, the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg came to pay his respects at the Nevsky Monastery, where the body lay. The celebrated cleric expected to find an empty church, but he found it crowded to the doors with praying students. People wept in the monastery yards. Student groups intoned the Psalms and read passages from the Book of Job. The Metropolitan gazed on the scene and said, "They tell me these young men are atheists, and that they hate the church. What magic power has this dead man to bring them back to God?" The teacher called it the power of faith and prayer. Dostoevsky, he said, left an unfinished work in Russia. When he lay dying, he said he regretted most leaving the world before he had fully expressed himself. This unfinished task, the teacher declared, would now be completed from the realm of the living dead. Dostoevsky was praying. He was not alone in this mission. Tolstoy was also standing in the shadows, keeping watch over Russia and exerting his influence on the people. This immensely imaginative author-dramatist was, according to the teacher, becoming ever more important among the people. I was inclined to agree. I had heard Tolstoy discussed frequently in Russia. Usually he was dismissed as a good writer and a poor philosopher, but he was never ignored. The persuasive power of his idealism was once more catching the interest of the masses. So was his sense of humor. A Russian who once asked me about the fanatical speed of American life said we evidently had never heard of Tolstoy's mathematical law. This law said, in effect, that the faster a man drives, the less necessary is the business to which he is driving. The rapidity of travel is in inverse proportion to its utility. Most of all, Tolstoy was being rediscovered because of his views on war and peace. He had believed implicitly in non-resistance and had sought to practice it. He used to say that the greatest part of the Bible is the New Testament, the greatest part of the Gospels, the words of Christ, the greatest words of Christ, the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest part of the Sermon on the Mount, the 5 Commandments, and the greatest of the 5 Commandments. Ye have heard it said of old, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that every one who is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment. Tolstoy is coming back, said the teacher. Everyone today is talking about peace and a new approach to the problem of war. He contended that Russians were beginning to reassess Tolstoy's views on religion. After all, Leo Tolstoy had been a loyal member of the Orthodox Church for nearly 50 years before he began to ask seriously the inevitable questions: what is the meaning of life? Where does it lead? Why are we here? The questions Tolstoy asked are the questions modern Russia is asking, explained my informant. You cannot drive them out of a person's heart by force. You cannot satisfy them by advances in science or promises of newer and greater mechanical achievements. There is a spiritual search that will change communism if the search is sufficiently sincere. It will change it not by a revolution, but by the people's declaration of what they want out of life. We will find the answers to Tolstoy's questions where Tolstoy found them, in the simple faith of the peasants. My informant felt that the way of life and the hope of salvation which Tolstoy found among the peasants are things that neither communism nor the Russian Church understands. It is possible for the Church to understand them because organized religion and government are out of touch with what Tolstoy called the inner light. Tolstoy, he insisted, was praying not for church or state, but for the people. When I told him I had spent considerable time among the Canadian Dukhobers, who are ardent Tolstoyans, he was thrilled. The Dukhobers, Russians who left the Orthodox Church long before the Revolution, claimed that God was being replaced by secularism and accused both Russian Orthodoxy and Tsarism of being partners in the crime. The story is told of a Dukhobor who informed a Russian general that his people would never bear arms in any cause. Said the general, "How dare you refuse when both church and state tell you you must?" "Church and state may tell us we must," replied the Dukhobor, "but Christ and Tolstoy have told us we must not." After much discussion, the general said, "I agree with you, it would be well to turn the other cheek if every person did the same. But as long as there are Turks ready to invade us, we must be ready to fight. The time for non-resistance has not yet come. To this the Doukhobor replied, "Well, General, I don't know whether the time has come for you, but it has come for us." There was an important point here, the teacher believed, not so much in the field of non-resistance as in the overall struggle of the masses against religion and the government. Many modern Russians secretly believe that the true faith can never be found in an institution, no matter how religious its name, or in a political party, no matter how strong its power or its claims. More and more people are quietly working out their spiritual philosophy in their own hearts. The very authority which urges them to think realistically is at the same time unwittingly giving them the liberty to make an honest appraisal of their religious and political masters. Tolstoy, said my informant, was speaking for modern Russia when he said, "For years I did not go to church. I no longer believed what had been taught me, but I believed in something. I believed in God, or rather, I never denied God, though often I could not have said what sort of a God. But since I exist, there must be some cause for my existence, a cause of causes. The first cause is what men call God. As soon as I acknowledged that there is this force in whose power I am, I felt that I could live again." The teacher looked upon the forces of organized religion with quiet contempt, and upon communism with a sigh of patient waiting. His strength and comfort lay in the knowledge that the dead, and praying, and as far as he was concerned, nothing could stop the powers of their prayers. It would be next to impossible for any Russian force, or any American force, or any other kind of force to keep God from his place in the hearts of the people. Often when talking with him, I felt that his faith was a great deal stronger than mine, surer, certainly, in his concept of the communion of saints. He meant actually communication with the dead, and the influence of the dead in the lives of the living. It was more than a guardian angel idea. It was unquestioned belief in the availability of a psychic force. What an episode this really was, here in Russia, 1,000 miles inside the so-called godless land, in the chosen city of the dead. Discredited Stalin. I was learning about the nature of the Christian life. Even the most orthodox of our theologians would have agreed that here was the hint, at least that life is a participation between the host of heaven and the people of earth. It came mighty close to our vaunted concept of the mystical body, whose members, many believe, share one common life, have our spiritual well-being at heart, and who, so we are often told, aid us in our struggle against the flesh, the world, and the devil. My friend also included Nicholas Berdyev in his saintly pantheon, insisting that when the religious revival begins in Russia, the eminent philosopher will have a voice in it. Berdyev was the one-time Marxist in whom Christian idealism won a victory, a prototype of what could happen to the Russian intelligentsia, who had never been reconciled to the existing spiritual void in Soviet thought. Tolstoy's appeal was to the masses, Berdyev's especially to the intellectuals. Berdyaev opposed communism on the grounds that it enslaved the spirit. He had no quarrel with its economic theories, actually, and saw a great deal of good in its collectivistic program. He was a socialist at heart. He might have remained a champion of Marxism had it not been for Marx's transference of personal conscience to the collective state. This, he felt, led to a new form of idolatry, similar to the idolatry found in any form of nationalism. God, said Berdyaev, has laid upon man the duty of being free, of safeguarding freedom of spirit, no matter how difficult that may be, or how much sacrifice and suffering it may require. Spiritual freedom was the keynote of Berdyaev's thought. He felt that communism improved everything, yet improved nothing because it denied the soul's right to the quest for truth. Communism refused to accommodate people in their spiritual quest. It allowed no man's mind to live and move freely in the realm of search and discovery. Communism's theory was brotherhood, but its practical result was enslavement. Stripped of all glamour and high-sounding phrases, communistic philosophy had as its goal the superiority of an economic process over spiritual principles. Economics must exist for man, Berdyaev argued, not man for economics. He criticized communism because of its lust for material power, and condemned Western Christianity by the same token. He argued that it was just as disastrous for a free nation to live under the delusion that wealth is a sign of virtue, as it was for a dictatorship to assume that the social forms of work are in themselves the supreme and only good. Berdyaev believed that work is worship, and true freedom is the organization of society by such a means as will guarantee the opportunity of work and creation to every man. Whenever Christianity or communism hinders or thwarts this ideal, each is guilty of dishonesty and aggression. Every man, said Berdyaev, is made in the image of God, however indistinct that image may become, and every man is called to eternal life. The problem of class war is above all a spiritual and moral problem, which involves a new attitude of Christians toward man and society, and a religious renewal of all mankind. The teacher saw Russia as a battleground for these ideals, as Stalingrad had been a battleground for proving a people's faith. He saw both Christianity and communism confronted by the struggle of a people against enslavement. Tomorrow's religion in Russia, he predicted, would represent a vital, fresh, and honest approach to faith and God. There was a time, he made clear, when it was impossible to think of religious faith apart from institutionalized religion. There were rites to be performed, and symbols to be understood, and sacraments to be kept. Man felt that God and the Church were indivisible, and that if they ever denied the Church, they would be the victims of some terrible divine visitation. Today, as far as he was concerned, that theory was no longer tenable. War, suffering, communism have thrown the theory of an omniscient, infallible church into the discard. God is a different God than he was when faced with the eyes of fear, according to Berdyaev and others among the praying saints. Man can determine his own fate in the present world and in the world to come. When he learns how far-reaching, how comprehensive, and how explicit this fate can be, he will return to God with a deeper consecration than he ever knew under the Church's rule. I was assured that when this return to faith actually took hold of the Russian masses, we Americans would be shamed by their devotion and embarrassed by their demonstration of religious fervor. God always has purpose, the teacher warned, and his purpose in Russia is to bring a new and higher form of life out of the spiritual chaos through which Russia has passed. Such was one man's opinion. The living dead were praying, and those who thought the victory of Stalingrad had been accomplished without prayer would one day learn the truth. Heaven, I was being informed, is on the side of the Russian people, and heaven meant not only God in Christ, but those also who had lived and died on Russian soil. Priests whom I interviewed in Stalingrad smiled patiently at such a theory. Their attitude was the same as that of priests and ministers elsewhere in this largest country in the world. They had no prediction about religion's future, except to insist that there is now, and will continue to be, a separation of church and state, and an ever-increasing freedom to worship. One day I sat with 3 clergymen of the Orthodox faith in a cathedral at Stalingrad. The edifice, like most open churches, had been rebuilt from the ground up. One of the priests said, "Self-sacrifice restored the churches, just as the sacrifices of self saved the city." He drew up chairs around a small table in the transept. At this 10 o'clock morning hour, a few women were grouped together in prayer, making the sign of the cross over and over and bowing low in front of the icons. They also divided their attention between me and my host, the Archbishop Dniprovsky. I learned from the Archbishop that the Church's hierarchy consists of the Patriarch, who is elected by the nearly 100 bishops, presbyters, and rank-and-file clergymen. The Holy Synod is made up of 6 members, 3 permanent and 3 serving for 6 months. I was told that the state does not interfere in ecclesiastical elections or in the affairs of the local congregations. The Archbishop said he could confirm this out of his own experience. The separation of church and state is definitely a reality, he reported. The Church now has 7 seminaries and 2 academies located in Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, Zhytomyr, Odessa, Stavropol, and Saratov. They are preparing some 2,000 men for the priesthood. When I mentioned the Church's claim of 50 million constituents and said it seemed fantastically high to me, he assured me he considered the figure quite correct. He said there were some 22,000 Orthodox congregations. The Patriarch of Moscow maintains jurisdiction over Russian Orthodox parishes in Tehran, Jerusalem, East Germany, England, France, and several in North and South America. He told me frankly that the 5 restored churches in Stalingrad were deemed sufficient for the city's present needs. When more churches are needed, more will be provided, he was sure, by the people's government. I asked him how many worshippers came to the cathedral for Sunday services. He said about 1,500. How many dropped in for daily meditation? About 150. What percent of the communicants are young people of school and college age? He was prompt to say that 10 to 15% would be found in this age category. In answer to my question, what is the main task of the church? His answer was immediate. It prepares people for the next life. Do you think communists who do not believe in another life, and who do not avail themselves of such preparation, will live again? He looked at me patiently and smiled. Are we to know or to judge either man or God? He asked, as if to say that harmony with the government is more urgent just now than the defense of faith. He claimed 25,000 communicants for the cathedral. He was proud of a new Bible, published by permission of both the Patriarch and the government. It was a reprint of the Niconian version, first published in the third quarter of the 17th century. It used modern Russian characters while preserving the old Church Slavic language. I brought Lorena to the church later to take a picture of this new Bible, but we could not get the required permission. However, the Archbishop and one of his immediate subordinates generously posed for us and treated us with a graciousness we will not soon forget. About these men was the same unspeakable sadness I had found in priests elsewhere in Russia. It revealed their inner depths more than words ever could. It gave a hint of their frustration, bordering on a kind of warning, as if in the quiet of their hearts they were whispering, "Do not ask me the cause. Do not ask me to explain. Just believe me when I say we trust and wait on God." At such times the groups who hovered credulously around the icons seemed to me a good deal happier in their religion than did the priest. There was apparently no struggle in their hearts so far as conflict with the state was concerned. They had what they wanted, the right to worship as fully and freely as they wished. No longer were red watchers lurking outside cathedral doors. No longer was worship disdained as in the years following the Revolution, or scorned and spied upon as in the days of the tyrant Stalin. Things were steadily getting better for the church, and to the lowly worshippers it was a growing sign that God is good. This was often my feeling. There is another large group of worshippers in Russia, some 18 million, who are known as the Old Believers. They represent the most formidable schism in Russian Orthodoxy, and are today as doggedly sure of their position as they were 300 years ago, when they broke away from the Mother Church. At that time, a peasant priest rose to the position of a notorious ecclesiastical crusader. He was Patriarch Nikon, who, like every other Christian reformer, argued for a form of faith based on apostolistic truth, the kind Christ would honor when he returned to earth again. Nikon set about to revise and purify the church by correcting errors, which he claimed had crept into the ritual ever since the faith was brought to Russia from Byzantium. In the light of Russian religion today, or the lack of it, Nikon's proposed reforms can hardly be taken seriously. To the communist, they are absurd, another disgusting episode in the tragicomedy of faith, for Nikon demanded that the sign of the cross be made with 3 fingers instead of 2. He insisted upon a 3-fold rather than a 2-fold Alleluia in the liturgy. It was high time, he said, that these grievous errors be corrected and that the divine offense be removed. God was troubled, Nikon told the people, greatly troubled at these liturgical inaccuracies. Equally troubled was Jesus, because for years the Church had been misspelling the Savior's name. It was Isus in place of Isus, had been doing so for generations. And now the time had come to make amends. Another thing, for hundreds of years church processions had been marching as the sun marches around the heavens, when actually it was God's wish that his people march counter-sunwise. These were some of the patriarch's issues at a time when the serfs were being bound to the land by intrigue and plot. Corruption was running wild, and Polish and Russian Christians were slaughtering each other on the battlefield. Backed for a time by the powerful influence of Tsar Alexis, who referred to Nikon as the most intimate friend of my body and soul, the Patriarch used his church reform as a plot for grabbing personal and ecclesiastical power, while the Tsar was directing the military campaign against the Poles. Nikon managed the affairs of state like a dictator, playing both roles, the roles of Pope and Emperor. Eventually Alexis broke with him, and the Church broke with him as well, but both state and Church, for reasons of their own, endorsed his proposed reforms. Those who refused to accept them, who still insisted on making the sign of the cross with 2 fingers instead of 3, and of writing Isus instead of Isus, were now dubbed Raskolniki or Schematics, and came to be known as the Old Believers. Incidentally, the course of the sun, say the Old Believers, indicates precisely the course that church processions must take. Even today, most of them consider it a mortal sin to go counter-sunwise, or to pronounce the name of Jesus in 3 syllables instead of 2. To eat potatoes is also still a heresy with many of them, for to them potatoes are the forbidden fruit of paradise. Tobacco is even more abominable. When Peter the Great asked them if smoking was worse than drinking, the Raskolniki said, "Smoking is worse, for the Bible says, not that which goeth into a man, but that which cometh out defileth him." But even the Old Believers, the ceremonial sticklers, broke up into 2 camps, so that soon there were the priestly and the priestless, and both were severely persecuted by church and state, until the advent of Catherine I, who shielded all sorts of sects, and was friendly to all sorts of schismatics. Today, the leaders of the Old Believers still fight the battle for Isus, and the leaders of Orthodoxy fight the battle of Isus, and each in its own camp struggles for power, while the people make the sign of the cross with 2 fingers or with 3 fingers, and while the dead are praying. A young Stalingrad communist had this to say about it all. Religion is perpetuated not by love, but by hate. Its history is the story of one group opposing another group. Neither Christianity nor any other religion could survive on the principles they proclaim. They grow only on dissension. They survive only on hate. I discovered, however, that religion for individuals survived rather mightily on love too, especially on love of God. It is dangerous to be prophetic, but the city on the Volga often tempted me to believe the maxim which said, "He who comes to Stalingrad without faith will find it here." I had an interpreter, a girl of 25, who refused to take any pay for the help she had given me in a number of interviews. When Lorena and I walked home with her, she invited us in for a cup of tea. The second-floor room she lived in was barren, cold. A few scant bits of furniture, a couple of unframed pictures, 2 improvised shelves of books, and a sleeping cot were the furnishings of her apartment. She made no excuses for its appearance other than to say, "Now you can see how a working girl must live." In the cubicle which served as kitchen, Lorena helped her make up some cheese and caviar sandwiches. Tea was prepared on the rusted 2-burner hot plate, but when we were served, the girl brought in a lovely silver sugar bowl. Because of our interest in antiques, and because of the striking contrast between this valuable possession and the austere surroundings, we commented on it. "Ah, that," she said, "that is all there is left of my parental home." She then told us how, during one of the innumerable raids, she and her parents had crawled to safety underneath the basement steps. Did we know that this is one of the best places to hide when the bombs are falling? Of course, there is actually no place one could hide, especially if the planes carry phosphorus bombs. Their fire, she explained, shuddering, crawls everywhere like snakes, setting everything ablaze, especially the asphalt streets and even the ground. There is no escape at such times. She went on to say that on this particular night, when they crouched beneath the cellar steps, it was straight bombing. Her family had been miraculously spared then, but before the war was over, she had lost both her father and her mother, as well as her 4 brothers. In 45 minutes of strafing, the section of town in which they lived was leveled. In the morning, when they crept out through the rubble and debris, everything was gone. She remembered how open the sky seemed to her. That morning, the shock of the night of terror was bad enough, but the most fearful thing to her was the unobscured view of the sky. Nothing hid it any longer. No rooftops, no buildings, no chimneys, no steeples pointed upward as a link between man and God. She hoped we would forgive her sentimentality, especially since she could not adequately explain to us just what she meant or what she felt about the sight of the unobstructed heavens. It was as if she stood naked before the eyes of God, as if she had never realized until then how small and guilty one can feel when looking up into the vast expanse of blue and clouds. Even now, whenever she got out of the city, whenever she walked through open space, she relived that morning when she and God stood face to face, where once had been her home. Days later, while prowling in the ruins, she found the silver sugar bowl. Who could say how this was spared or why, or how or what protected it so that it suffered hardly a dent or scratch. It was a symbol and a sign of what she hardly knew. She never went to church. She had rarely been inside a church. Never until the day she went with me had she spoken to ministers or priests. She wondered if I could answer her questions, since my field was religion. Could I tell her why some people were taken in the war and others left? Why were some, like her father and mother, who had never knowingly injured anyone, compelled to suffer more than others? Would I tell her if I knew why religion had so few answers for the great things in life, great things like peace and war, love and hate? Why so often did there seem to be no difference between religious people and the non-religious? Could I explain why innocent Germans died because of Hitler? Why innocent Russians died because of Stalin? And why even the wisest men know so little about God? How did I think American Christians would react if God were to take away their livelihood, their possessions, their loved ones, and their joy? Beneath her earnest questioning, I too stood beneath the open sky. Just now I scarcely had an answer to the mystery of the silver sugar bowl, much less to questions about God and the Soviets. There was an answer, but it required faith, faith of a kind that had lived in a Dostoevsky, a Tolstoy, a Berdyaev, and of the kind that had not died in Stalingrad. I suppose the answer was, there is no victory without prayer, whether in saving a city or in saving a soul. They never lose God who have Him in their hearts. To be sure, this might not be the whole answer, and surely it was no easy assignment, always to believe it. But in the quiet afterthought, amid the apparent hopelessness of these surroundings, I felt myself coming around to the teacher's point of view. It must be that the dead are praying, and that somehow their prayers and ours as well. Chapter 7. Wait for the morning. Moscow the Holy. That is how Napoleon described the city in Tolstoy's War and Peace. Madame de Staël, who figured in the French Revolution, viewed Moskva from the Kremlin heights and exclaimed, "Behold another Rome." Visitors to Russia today have an appraisal no less sincere, the showcase city of the Soviets. Their reference, however, is not to churches, temples, or monasteries. They mean a modern metropolis, which compared to Russia at large, is like an industrial fair in a wilderness, scrupulously clean, as most Russian cities are. Moscow's streets are doubly scrubbed. Its automobiles are ordered by law to be clean. Its parks of rest and culture are reflectively quiet. Its public squares are spacious. Its skyline is constantly growing. Its buildings are dignified. Its people serious and proud. Muscovites told me that their 34-story university building is the finest in the world, the GUM department store the largest in the world, and the Kremlin the most spectacular governmental headquarters in this or any other world. They may be right about the Kremlin, for this ancient citadel of the Tsars, in a country now dedicated to atheism, contains 3 magnificent cathedrals, 6 churches, 4 palaces, and a number of museums, hoarding ecclesiastical treasures as priceless as those of its foremost rival, the Vatican. Jeweled crosses, gem-studded Bibles, silver chalices, gold icons, crowns, armlets, vestments, and royal carriages occupy room after room. I was assured that this entire hoard of holy effects now belongs to the proletariat. Nothing but cages of shining glass separate the sightseers from the heirlooms of their old oppressors, church and state. Only the alert and omnipresent guards keep the people from climbing into the great white throne of Ivan the Terrible, or fingering the cross which once dangled at the breast of Metropolitan Nikon. The clouds of glory have been rolled back. Here, as elsewhere in the Soviet Union, the masses roam the rooms of czars and patriarchs. Even the domineering tower of Ivan the Great, whose nearly 300-foot height cross spreads its shadow over the red Kremlin walls, holds little terror for the common man. He has been told he is the conqueror, and he wanders through the sovereign grounds. It all seems true. Outside the walls stands a hallowed shrine, a royal reliquary containing the ghost-like hands and heads of Stalin and Lenin. Rumor has it that heads and hands are all that remain, that the bodies have been dismembered, but the thousands who form the block-long quays show no concern. They wait with infinite patience in the rows of worshippers, who move a step at a time, through a burial garden, where other communists are interred. Gradually they reach the granite sarcophagus, and finally pause in the mystic stillness of the holy tomb. Here they stand in a moment of supplication to whatever it is they believe in, a ceremonial of thought into which not even the sharp, intensive eyes of the guards can intrude. Across Red Square, the Divine Mother of all cathedrals, St. Basil's, stands decked out in full canonicals. Its multicolored, onion-shaped domes, its haughty tower, its majesty and haunting grace have kept their vigil over the Kremlin fortress for 300 years. Like the cathedrals inside the Kremlin, it is now a museum, no doubt the most notorious and magnificent one in all of Christendom. Built by Ivan the Terrible, St. Basil's has ever been an object for romance and superstition. Among the most popular legends is the much-repeated story of Ivan's ordering the architect's eyes gouged out so that he might never again create a building of such immortal beauty. Lorena, of course, photographed St. Basil's and every other cathedral from every conceivable angle. She was convinced that the crowds who visited and revisited these once hallowed places of worship did so because of a longing for something now lost. They wished to pray in these holy spots, but prayer has gone out of fashion. They are ambitious to recall the past, she thought. They have the will to worship, but not the privilege, while we in America have the privilege and all too often not the will. It was easy to read almost any point of view into the mystifying medley that went in and out of the cathedrals. I remembered how an Orthodox priest told me that the ground on which a church is erected is forever holy, and the spot on which the altar stands is like the footstool of God. Not even a patriarch can unconsecrate it. Though the church vanish and the altar be destroyed, the time will come, he said, when God will punish those who have defamed his house. Every Russian knows this, he assured me, as does every communist. And I wondered about this as the crowd milled in and out of the gilded and jeweled and icon-crowded sanctuaries with their frescoed walls. You could imagine any one of them to be a Dulam's cave, or just a sideshow where the thin faces of Russian monks and martyrs leer down from every shadowy cupola. Lorena was sentimental. She persuaded a policeman to take our pictures in front of St. Basil's. He wanted to know what we planned to do with it. When our interpreter informed him we would use it as a Christmas card, he shook his head in sheer unbelief and walked away. I wonder what he would have said of the finished product, for we did use it later, together with a picture of a chapel back home, and captioned it, "In hometown church or Kremlin Square, it's Christmas, Christmas everywhere." If St. Basil's stirs the Russian masses with some sort of assurance that their leaders have triumphed over the past, there is an attraction underground which convinces them that communism is also well equipped to cope with the problems of the present, even as their space satellites assure them to trust their leaders for the conquest of tomorrow. Underground, beneath the parks and palaces, beneath the ancient buildings and modern city traffic, is the metro, which can be insulted if you refer to it as only the subway. The metro is a super subway, a series of underground cathedrals or stations, artistically constructed in granite and marble, and without question the most remarkable underground railway in all the world. There are 45 of these amazing stations, not two alike, with entrances so attractive that they are referred to as the portals of transportation. To the 3.5 million passengers who daily pass through this subterranean fairyland, Soviet achievement is real and spectacular, and it is no less real and spectacular to those who daily watch the Sputnik skies. We too made our easy pilgrimage down the long, steep escalators, and rode enough of the 100 metro miles to confirm the view that the capital city below the ground is as absorbing as it is on the surface. The metro is a cameraman's paradise. Lorena photographed the statues and the inlaid ceilings, the tiled floors with their intricate patterns, the ingenious lighting fixtures, and the artistically modern chandeliers. She was given permission to shoot the interior of a new subway car, dazzlingly clean and as comfortable as any subway coach can possibly be. She took pictures of the people who posed unsmilingly amidst the unbelievable quiet of the subway traffic. She rode the escalator with her open camera and was allowed to use a flash, despite a general standing rule to the contrary. But our major interest was religion in this capital of irreligious state. There were more than 1,000 houses of worship in Moscow when Napoleon called the city holy. We found less than 60. 100 years ago, the population of Moscow was about 1 million. Today, it is 5.5 million. In the days of Tsarist rule, the church was so powerful that a Romanov was required to wear the lowly garb of a deacon when receiving the Holy Eucharist. Today, no Russian ruler could be persuaded to partake of the sacrament, even if it were served to him on a golden platter inside the Kremlin walls. On Palm Sunday, In the days when the Church ruled Russia, the Tsar, bearing a palm branch in one hand, led the horse upon which the Patriarch sat playing the role of Christ. Today, no ruling communist would so much as raise his hand in recognition of the symbolism here involved. I had speculated on these contrasts many times, and in Moscow my thoughts on Russian religion were by no means conclusive. On my very first day in the city, I met a Muslim imam. I told him of my visit to the mosque in Leningrad, close by the Museum of the Great October Revolution. He knew the place. It seemed significant to him that the mosque should be located, for it was Lenin, father of the revolution, who, after the oppression and looting by the Tsars, urged the Islamic people of Russia to rebuild their houses of worship and reaffirm their faith. But I queried, has it been possible for you to reaffirm your faith under Soviet rule? He looked at me for a studied moment, and then exclaimed, "Why, of course." Again I wondered whether this was honest conviction or simply fear of the frightful force and ruthless character of the Red regime. "Isn't it true," I asked, "that the communists, after promising not to hinder the propagation of your faith, ordered the unveiling of Muslim women and tried to communize your people with atheistic views?" "Things change," demurred the imam, in a voice of non-committal. "Things change all over the world." I told him I'd been informed that the communists forbade Muslims to fast during the sacred Islamic month of Ramadan. Fasting, said the party, weakened the factory workers so that they could not satisfactorily do their jobs. The imam evaded the point of all this by saying, "We observe our holy Ramadan." Of course we do. Like every other cleric, this Muslim minister had only friendly phrases for the Soviets, yet I had the feeling that deep down in his heart he wanted to say, "The people of Allah are fighting for their lives," but he did not say it, and any such perception on my part was again purely intuitional. And in Russia particularly, in Moscow, I was beginning to doubt even my intuition. Could I ever arrive at a final appraisal of religion in the USSR? Was it true that we worship and we wish and preach what we please? Or was freedom of conscience and freedom of religious expression carefully rationed out by the government, just as is freedom of the press and freedom of assembly? Is the Church's future relentlessly held in the Kremlin's iron hand? In Moscow, a series of events gave me a clearer insight into all this than I had been able to find elsewhere along the way. For instance, late one afternoon, I walked around to a Russian Orthodox church a few blocks from my hotel. The huge black doors were locked, but in the churchyard an elderly woman was busily making flower arrangements with affectionate care. I indicated my desire to get inside the church, and she escorted me to a side entrance. Making my way to the foyer, I found the reason for the locked doors. It was clean-up time in the house of God. The sole occupants were a number of charwomen, a photogenic group if I ever saw one, and I would have given a lot to have had Lorena with me, a wrinkled, explosively fat woman, her cherubic face framed by a white scarf, was reverently polishing a candelabra. Her attitude was one of absolute bliss. Whoever made this candelabra centuries ago could have had no greater sense of achievement than did this woman with the scrap of cloth. A short distance from her was a chubby matushka, swishing a mop round and round in a pool of dirty water. Her crimson and white head covering, together with the long black skirt sweeping about her feet, made her look like a puppet, which now and again raised its eyes for an ecstatic glimpse at a Madonna high overhead. A younger woman was gouging the hardened tallow out of the candle holders, and another girl was fervently putting a high gloss on the saint in his icon. Other daughters of Martha were cleaning sacred items in a far corner of the church. Intermittently they made the sign of the cross, and bowing low, let it be known that this was their hour for being acolytes as well as laborers in the temple. I was absorbed in the scene when a young bearded priest came in. He looked at me as if to say he had been told a stranger had gotten in, but soon he was smiling, as I was, at the ardor of the women and the fascination of the scene. With meaningful emphasis, he laboriously picked an English word. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, many people." Yes, I agreed. All will be scrubbed and ready. "Tomorrow," he repeated, and his eyes had a knowing look of promise. "Russia's tomorrow?" I questioned. "The church's tomorrow," he managed to say. His words were a sentimental symbol, and perhaps not wholly in conformity with reason, but they told a story in a setting I would long remember. As far as the faithful were concerned, their devotion was sure and their hope confident. Tomorrow the worshippers would return. Tomorrow the church would once more triumph. I may have read too much into his words. The scene may not have been an honest preview of things to come, but it seemed like something of an answer. Could it be that throughout Russia, religion was making its subtle concession to the government in the hope of eventually overthrowing its liberators? The following day I met a young Muscovite wearing the red jacket of a Protestant denominational school, Spurgeon College in England. He was a student there and had returned home for a short vacation. I asked him about the churches tomorrow and how he expected to win the atheistic Russians back to Christianity. "We must witness," he exclaimed. "Many of our people are doing just that. They are testifying for Christ, not only by speaking, but by living the life. Oh, they speak about him too, while they work, and whenever they meet someone who is ready for the message." Is this permissible? His answer was, "We have as much religious liberty as we dare to take." He meant it. He was one of the most outspoken and evangelistically minded men I had met. This was Russia, but this was also Moscow, and Moscow religious enthusiasts were looking forward to tomorrow. In Moscow, the religious scene began to make sense. Gradually I had the feeling that my questions were being answered. I found a Roman Catholic church and attended early Mass. I visited a Jewish synagogue where the scrolls of the Torah were being read. I went around to the mosque where the Muslim faithful knelt in prayer. I met several Mennonites and Seventh-day Adventists, and one Jehovah's Witness. They were all waiting for tomorrow and looking forward to the morning. They all told me, in effect, that religion is up to the people, and that while Russia may be a laboratory for atheism, it is even more a laboratory for faith, the like of which has not been found on earth since the days of Caesar. The question these religious leaders are asking, how fervently do people actually want religion, was being answered with a question from the masses: what do you have to give us? This lack of rapport is certainly part of the impasse that exists between organized religion and the proletariat. In a way, it is not too different from the situation in our own country, where some 70 million Americans are not identified with any church and are frequently asking, what can institutionalized religion do for me? And under the circumstances, what, if anything, can I do for it? And this, it seemed to me in Moscow, is how things stand, with the overpowering, outspoken voice of Marxism speaking a bit more clearly than either preachers or the proletariat. Religion, said communism's founder, is man's consciousness and awareness of himself when he has either not come into his own or has lost himself. Religious misery is both the expression of real misery and a protest against real misery. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the temper of a heartless world, as it is the spirit of inanimate circumstances. It is the people's opium. This bothersome phrase, the people's opium, is shrugged off by most churchmen as they look forward to tomorrow. They are thinking in terms of present coexistence with Marxists. What else can be done? In Moscow, I was asked again and again whether we in America are not also divided between those who go to church and those who do not. When I said that we never gave this distinction much thought, they said neither did they. Unlike any of us who might hold the view, they did not foresee a period when all men would turn to God. As churchgoers and non-churchgoers work together in America, so churchgoers and Marxists work together in Russia. This, they said, is what Americans did not or would not understand. There were also those here in the capital city of the Soviets who expected the religion of the future to be centered strongly in a church purified, endowed with authority, a pure theocratic authority, the authority of God invested in consecrated men of God. I met one of these men of God in the person of Metropolitan Nikolai. He is a powerful influence in Russian Orthodoxy, especially in the work that is going forward to bring schismatic churches of Russia and other lands into the Orthodox fold. Supported by his superior, Patriarch Alexei, Nikolai has been emphatically outspoken about freedom and peace, and how these goals are being obstructed by the West. He once referred to the United States as a country where people are lynched, where children are kidnapped, where SARS bombs are thrown among the workers, where bread is burned before the eyes of the famished, where those who attempt to give the term freedom its authentic meaning are thrown into prisons, where gold is used for the bribing of those abroad, where there is freedom to steal, to subjugate, and to kill. These were his words some 10 years ago and it may be that he has changed his opinion through the years. At any rate, I first met him at a mid-afternoon reception at the U.S. Embassy. It was a July 4th observance, and the Metropolitan had dropped around to pay his respects. When I first caught sight of him in a crowded room, he was holding out his hand so that an Anglican priest from America could bend his head low over it and perhaps touch it with his lips. Incidentally, the Orthodox Church has assured the Anglican Communion that it would welcome it into its unity and would happily recognize the validity of Anglican orders. Nikolai stood tall and picturesque in the full robes of his high office, his golden cross catching and reflecting shafts of light, his somber, brooding face beneath his gleaming mitre reminiscent of tales of ecclesiasticism in Tsarist days. Like all who wear the robes of sacrosanct offices, the Metropolitan is insulated against the public. He is neither annoyed nor shocked at emulation, but on this occasion and at subsequent meeting, he was gracious and generous with me, especially in answering my question about the progress of religion in Russia. We could rest assured, he insisted, that church and state were harmoniously working together without interference, one from the other. Technically, the government has two councils. The first, the Council on Orthodox Church Affairs, was created by the government in 1943, the year that marked special Easter celebrations, even the lifting of the curfew and the observance of midnight services. Much of this was in recognition of the Church's contribution to the government's struggle against Hitler's Wehrmacht. The council was designed to clarify relations between orthodoxy and communism, to deal with laws relevant to church affairs, and to supervise the execution of these laws. The second council set up by the government carries the ominous-sounding title of Council for the Affairs of Religious Cults. This is a five-man liaison body between the Kremlin and non-Orthodox churches. It is an assistance council designed to help churches in the procurement of material for church improvement and worship, to assist in matters dealing with public relations, and to aid in locating and planning new church groups. I was informed that when 20 or more people gather together and affirm their intention of starting a new church, one would very likely be forthcoming. The group would appeal to the respective council, and the machinery for establishing a place of worship would be set in motion. The whole thing sounded incredibly easy. And in Moscow, I was frequently reminded that the governmental lifting of church restrictions during the critical years of the war was not forgotten. During Holy Week, when Moscow was in a state of siege, the Metropolitan Nikolai urged the parishes to ensure the strictest observance of all nighttime regulations. But he was also urging the government to permit the people the utmost opportunity for worship. When news came that the commandant of Moscow had decided to allow the citizens freedom of movement and freedom of worship, a grateful Orthodox public praised both church leaders and state officials. Our joy knew no bounds. One of the faithful related, "Everyone with one voice expressed thanks, and with peaceful and singing hearts prepared for the Easter festival. Streams of people could be seen carrying little bundles in their hands. These were little parcels carefully tied in spotless white napkins and tablecloths. They were the traditional kulik and pascha Easter cakes. I asked an old woman, "Are you going to church, Grandma?" "Yes, I am going to have the pascha blessed," she replied. "Have you heard the new order that has gone out? May God bless the Soviet authorities. Go about the town without fear," it says, "and do what is customary at Easter time. No one will interfere with you." Young people who had never been inside a church, teenagers who were born after the war, had been told about the government's kindness to the church during the fateful days of the German siege. They were convinced their leaders had always done right by the old people who still needed religion. One of these young Russians, a girl employed in a Moscow hotel, who had helped me in the major task of locating a telephone directory, was dead sure that religion as an institutionalized force was dying out. When the old people are gone, the church will be gone as well, was her prediction. We talked about religion at great length. Her English was excellent, and she said she was constantly reading English authors. I told her I would send her one of my books. "Books will never convert me to God," she said with a laugh, "but if you have found in Him something to believe, and if you believe it enough to write about it, that is good." One evening, when she sat at her desk, smoothing out and counting a stack of crumpled rubles, I called her a typical American capitalist. She buried her head in her hands and laughed uproariously. A girl at a nearby desk wanted to know what I had said. The words were relayed and passed around until everyone in the room was laughing heartily and reminding me that for any Russian to be a capitalist was something so preposterous it could lend itself only to comedy. The girl said, "If you knew what we think of your primitive capitalistic system, you would know how funny this is." Later she explained that God and capitalism are contradictory. She said, if God is, He is whatever is good, and everyone knows that capitalism is bad. In subsequent talks with her, the question of who and what God might conceivably be came up again and again. She was interested in religion, but careful not to betray this interest to her associates. Travelers in Russia often refer to this growing inquisitiveness among young people as a sure sign of a religious revival. I never found it sufficiently widespread to give cause or hope for such optimism. Far from it. Nonetheless, it is an indication that the quest for God has not been sublimated into the search for national greatness or into the program for a revolutionary social order. Young Russians talked about this unsatisfied spiritual hunger more freely in Moscow than elsewhere. A distinction was always made, however, between religion and church religion. Whenever Lorena and I met evenings, having gone our separate ways during the day, we exchanged impressions, and we usually came by our own separate routes to the conclusion that here in this showcase city there is a very real conflict in these young Russians, a conflict between an atheistic mind and a spiritually inclined heart. The fact that Lorena and I often went out separately had its disadvantages, too, especially when I visited Zagorsk. I went without her to the famous Ch6-7 monastery on a day when the churches were crowded with pilgrims, and the air was filled with song. Here, some 40 miles from Moscow, was a panorama of Russian Orthodoxy. such as I had often imagined. Processions of visitors of all classes roamed the grounds, while the inscrutable hooded monks moved among them like a pageant out of the Tsarist past. Bells were ringing, candles were burning, royally robed dignitaries overawed the crowds, and beggars, mostly aged women, had a field day of alms-getting. I inquired whether this was a special holy day, and was told that every day at Ch6-7 is holy. You can come here any time, I was assured, and find thousands coming and going in and out of the huge archway cut into the 20-foot thick walls. This is the Mecca of Russian Orthodoxy, the native Jerusalem of the Eastern Church. It is Moscow's Pecherskaya, holding the blessed remains of the Church's most hallowed saint, Sergius, the nobleman who became a monk. Today his body lies in a silver casket, and those who chant and pray around the sarcophagus do so with childlike faith. They come, as did Princess Sophia, wife of Ivan the Great. She came on foot, as does every true child of the Church. She came to pray at the grave of the saint in the hope of obtaining a son. Sergius appeared to her in a vision, then thrust a male child into her bosom, and it was born 9 months later. Ivan the Terrible walked from Moscow to Ch6-7, praising God. So did Tsarist Maria and Catherine II, and many more. When I stood on top of the encircling mile-long wall and looked into the maze of domes and cupola, museums, monasteries, and the archiepiscopal palace, and when the chanting rose from the cathedral, I forgot for the moment that this was Russia. It might easily have been Rome. According to tradition, anyone who comes to Ch6-7 will have a vision. With Sergius, the saint, nothing is impossible. He retreated to this spot in 1342, when it was just a wilderness, with only a lonely hermitage. He built a chapel with his own hands, and called it the Source of Life. The faithful say the chapel has always lived up to its name. They are convinced that the destiny of Russia is foreshadowed by the destiny of Ch6-7 at Zagorsk, and that a nation's tomorrow can be judged by what transpires here today. So it has always been, they will tell you. In 1609, the monastery withstood a 16-month siege by the Poles. Later, when Moscow fell under Polish rule, the nucleus of resistance was again formed at Ch6-7, and Holy Mother Moscow was liberated. In the monastery of Ch6-7, the brothers Ars, Ivan and Peter, found refuge from the Strelites, and here Peter the Great outlined many of his campaigns and strategies. There are items at Zagorsk which can never be bought, and there are also items for sale. Among the first are priceless robes and jewels, and it is said more precious pearls than in all of Europe. Among the second were some ancient icons, which put my Rublov to shame. I bargained with the bearded monk in charge of these treasures, and found one for 300 rubles that I desperately wanted. I had nothing but traveler's checks, American, and here they could not be converted into coin of the realm. My interpreter and I tried our best to negotiate a purchase, but it was impossible. This was Russia. Neither monks nor priests nor Sergius himself was able to help me. The only thing I got out of the conversations was a proverb. Americans either carry too much money or not enough. It is always that way with the capitalistic imperialist. Even so, I loved Ch6-7, and it is one place I would love to visit. I felt a sense of freedom there, most of the kind we know in America. When I visited with several of the monastery officials, when I heard their enthusiasm for the young men who are preparing for the priesthood here, and especially when I took pictures of several smiling monks with my Polaroid, I felt a wholesomeness about Russian religion that I had not experienced elsewhere. If the teacher in Stalingrad believed the immortal dead were praying along the Volga, certainly they were walking and talking to us in Zagorsk. Even the children romping on the grounds that day seemed almost to be hearing a friendly voice saying, "Let them come unto me." The good, rich feeling of the day at Ch6-7 went back to Moscow with us. Our cabby was speeding along at a good pace, when suddenly he made a low, disgruntled outcry. He had caught sight of a motorcycle cop in his rearview mirror. We looked back, and my interpreter, with good American inflection, exclaimed, "Boy, oh boy! Caught for speeding in Russia," I thought. "What now?" And with nothing but traveler's checks, we pulled off the road, and in a moment the cop was sauntering up to our car with casual authority. The questions are the same all over the world. What's the hurry? Do you know how fast you are going? Your driver's license. Of course you know the speed in this zone. The answers were the same too, with a courteous "Da tovarish," "Yes, comrade," tacked on to every one of them. Then the driver's license, and the taxi were given another appraisal, and the officer threw me an inquiring glance. My interpreter friend spoke charmingly in Russian, and out of his words I caught Amerikansky and Zagorsk, and enough to understand why the cop nodded, touched his finger to his cap, told the driver in effect to watch it next time, and strolled off. As we resumed our trip, my interpreter leaned back casually and said, "There was nothing to worry about. Our police are always very courteous, as you saw. By the way, do you have a cigarette?" From here the conversation turned back to the USA, and questions as to how traffic officers handle things in our country. Soon I was being interrogated, as I had often been elsewhere in Russia, about the national temper of the American people, the characteristic traits, which the Soviet press has often said are molded in hate and racism, and fired in atrocities and crime. This, of course, led most logically to the inevitable topic of war and peace. We could never get away from it, for it cannot be said often enough that the communist peace offensive has been tremendously effective among its own people. We Americans have been made to live in the minds of the Russians as imperialistic aggressors. From all the propaganda which the Russian populace has heard, God and the Soviets are made to appear as closer partners in the cause for peace than God and the Americans can ever be. Books, pamphlets, and the daily talk of individuals on the subject of peaceful intentions invariably begin with a statement to the effect that the people of the Soviet Union unanimously want peace, and that is why we are so profoundly alarmed at the testing of bombs and missiles by the United States. Wherever I went, whether to a meeting in a cathedral or a taxi to Zagorsk, I was told that nowhere in the world Is any country working as fervently at establishing goodwill among men as is Russia? I was informed that the program was centered in a World Council of Peace, which had an affiliated office in Moscow called the Soviet Peace Committee. Russian clerics had often suggested that I drop in at this office and discover for myself how earnestly the work is progressing. TASS, the official Soviet news agency, was telling the Russian people that years ago, in late March 1949, the United States Peace Congress got off to a great start, only to be boycotted by reactionary imperialistic forces and Wall Street warmongers. The reference, of course, was to the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, which was held in New York at the Waldorf Astoria and closed with a mass meeting in Madison Square Garden. It was, as I recalled from American news reports, anything but a peaceful meeting. Shostakovich was there, so was the Polish author Ch6-7, the Cuban poet Gullian, the British philosopher William Olaf Stapledon, and other scientific and cultural figures from various foreign countries, as well as from the United States. At the time, our State Department said that the meeting was packed with communists, and that it was nothing more than a sounding board for communist propaganda. Many other Americans felt the same way about it. 2,000 banner-carrying pickets paraded the streets in front of the garden whenever meetings were held. They brandished signs reading, "Russians go home," "Free Cardinal Minzinski," "You're too red for us." To add to the confusion and travail of the birth of this Peace Congress, federal agents seized 3 Canadian delegates for alleged communist activities. A rival meeting under the heading of Americans for Intellectual Freedom was staged in New York at the same time, one of its leading figures being Alexander Kerensky, who had been president of the Provisional Government of Russia after the fall of the Tsar. All in all, the attempt at creating an international movement for peace resulted in a stormy session, and about the only memorable feature that came out of it was a statement by one participant summarizing the results of the conference. No one in the USSR wants war with the US, but many in the USSR fear American capitalism and hope it will be destroyed. No one in the US wants war with the USSR, but many in the US fear Russian socialism and hope it will be destroyed. The Soviet press reported to the Russian people that since the United States Peace Congress had been sacked, it was up to the Soviets to see it through. It repeated the claim that the most emphatic advocates and workers for peace were the members of the Soviet delegation. It was Russia's A.A. Fadyev who told the delegates, "It is almost impossible to find one unbiased American or Western European who, after setting foot on our soil, does not feel the healthy, peaceful pulse of life in the whole atmosphere of our country." I did not feel it quite that strongly. My reaction to Russia's will for peace was not quite so vivid, but surely the Organization for Peace as a concept regardless of peace as a workable reality, was very much in evidence. I realized that ever since the start of our trip, We had been reminded in signs and banners of Mira Droshba, peace and friendship. A Hindu whom I met in Moscow told me his country was convinced that Russia wanted peace more sincerely than did America. The World Council of Peace had made it clear that it was compelled to drop the United States and reorient itself entirely toward the Eastern world. This was obvious from reports in Pravda and Izvestia. They declared that through the years, 117 million Soviet citizens had signed an appeal for the conclusion of a peace pact among the five great powers: the USA, USSR, China's People's Republic, Britain, and France. They accused the USA, Britain, and France of carving a new war and making mad preparations for it. They said a handful of billionaires and millionaires need a new war to acquire super profits and to plunder other countries. Obviously, said Pravda, the USSR and the Chinese People's Republic must go it alone. The United States, it declared, believes that the existence of the United Nations and its charter makes a peace pact superfluous. American people are not free to choose peace, even if they desire it, said Tass. A report from the Moscow Patriarch was equally bitter. Capitalism needs and cherishes only a religion which propagandizes and strengthens and elucidates its dominant role in the state. The most tested and faithful servant of capitalism is the Vatican, which is turning more and more to America and the West. With all of this as a background, I went without the benefit of interpreter or in tourist guide to 10 Kropotkin Street, where the Soviet Peace Committee had its headquarters. 2 flights up I found spacious offices, an assembly hall, and a director's room, where I was greeted by Secretary Mikhail Kotov. He summoned 2 other men, one of whom spoke English very well, and asked me why I had come and where I had heard about the committee. When I explained that I had been touring Russia because of my interest in religion, that my field was religious research, they showed great interest. "Tell us," exclaimed Mr. Kotov, "why is America opposed to peace? Why are American churches afraid to cooperate with the World Council of Peace? You know, of course, that not a single representative of American churches attended our meeting in Ceylon. Why could not a bridge of understanding be built between our 2 great nations?" His voice rose with emotion. The interpreter also spoke with a passion I had not heard anywhere else, not even among the most devoted clergymen. I was given a briefing on the special sessions of the World Council of Peace. I was handed excerpts and quotations from the resolutions and recommendations. I was shown that at a meeting in Helsinki, the whole world was there with the exception of the United States. The World Council of Peace, I was assured, is the highest expression of the forces of peace which have succeeded in preventing the unleashing of a new world war. But they must now dispel the threat of war that hangs over mankind. Atomic and thermonuclear bombs hang by a thread over the heads of men, women, and children. Peace is indispensable. Peace is the greatest need. Peace is the prerequisite for the development of man's creative powers. I have been in revival meetings in many parts of the world, and I have spoken to religious enthusiasts in many nations. These men of the Soviet Peace Committee were bursting with a zeal which, self-generated or not, was almost charismatic. They were evangelists for peace, and they sounded like many of our high-powered radio preachers. They talked to me as if it had been years since anyone from America had dropped in on them. I felt they truly wanted friendship with our country. Their ways might not be our ways. Their motives might be open to suspicion, but these men surely had a job to do, to sell the world the feeling that Russia sincerely wants to dispel distrust. I felt that I was among crusaders, fiery crusaders for their cause. What is a person to say under these circumstances? I was torn by an inner conflict. Should I have said, "Well, gentlemen, we do not trust you. Yours is a government of broken promises. We have reason to believe that your overtures to us in behalf of peace are deceptive. You will have to convince us that you are acting in good faith and have no sinister motivation." I could have expressed other suspicions and fears. Communism does have a philosophy of world conquest. It has been known to incite war while deploring it. It is committed to the proposition that the individual is of less importance than the state. It could be that this office is only a facade, behind which there is lurking terror. How is a man to know? Who has the genius and the insight to judge these movements wisely and without prejudice, yet not naively and with too much trust? As I sat at the table with these wise men, I felt that never had there been a time or a place in history that required greater understanding. For it was, of course, part of my belief that the world could be saved, and would indeed need to be saved, through religious faith. Statistics flashed through my mind. What if all the religious people in the world could unite for peace, not in any attempt at uniformity or ecclesiastical conformity, but simply for the sake of creating a few solid years in which men could have a chance to live without fear and work without threat of war? There are nearly 500 million Roman Catholics in the world, nearly 250 million Protestants, and about 130 million Eastern Orthodox. There are 400 million Muslims, 320 million Hindus, 300 million Confucianists, 150 million Buddhists. Nearly all of the 2,600 million people in the world worship God, or some sort of God. Who among them does not desire peace? My thoughts swept around the globe to temples, mosques, cathedrals, churches, and shrines, but they always came back to Russia and this room, and to our suspicions, not of the Russian people, but of the communist regime. We can love the Russian masses with Christian compassion, but what shall we do about the communist plot? We can love the churches of Russia too, but what can we do with the statement of the Moscow Patriarch, which declared the Church regards with the greatest respect and the warmest appreciation the Soviet government, which expresses the will of the people and is constantly concerned for the welfare of the people? I remembered the report of American churchmen, 9 of them, who, after a visit to Russia, stated, "We are convinced that the Russian churches and people ardently desire peace. However, the World Peace Council has consistently taken the same line as that of the Soviet government, namely that participants from the West have not been truly representative of Western churches. We emphasized the necessity of finding some bases other than their past positions if we are to work together for peace. We made it clear that the means to peace are as important as the end. The impasse is crystal clear. We say that we are suspicious of the World Council of Peace, and the Russians tell us that they are suspicious of the World Council of Churches, which the churchmen represent. We say we want peace. The Russians say we want peace. The whole religious world is saying we want peace, and everyone, it seems, is ready to fight to prove it. It is a deadlock. The usual polemics are blocking all moves. We insist that Soviet beliefs make the scientific quest for objectivity impossible. They say that we are wrapped in our own subjective self-righteousness. We tell them that, according to their teaching, the individual is of less importance than the state. They retaliate by insisting that we are ambitiously trying to save our churchianity. We politely inform them that they have formally rejected the fatherhood of God. They shoot back that we have just as formally denied him by our refusal to cooperate in the brotherhood of man. The thing that bothered me most as I sat through these 2 hours of excited and heated pleas for peace was that we in America could not seem to negotiate with the Russians without the support of A-bombs and missiles and satellites. As Christians, we may not wish to follow the pattern of communism and bargain against a background of power and threats of our ability to retaliate and annihilate. But can we do otherwise? Do we have the courage and the wisdom to do otherwise? Can we conquer the world as Jesus did without force? This was his genius, but is it ours? Whether the World Council of Peace is a plot or the reflection of an honest hope, whether the American churches are right or wrong in rejecting the pleas of the Soviet Peace Committee, one thing is sure: the people of the world are sick and tired of war. They are fed up with burying their dead in the futility and waste of a struggle for power. They are determined to live without fear, and if religion cannot or will not help them achieve this end, they will look for help elsewhere, wherever it can be found. But where else can it be found? I thought of this especially when the secretary seized both my hands in his and, with burning Russian aggressiveness, pleaded with me to investigate more thoroughly their documents and resolutions so that I could see for myself how sincere they are. I said to myself exactly what many other American would have said. If these men are sincere, we should talk to them again. If they are not, let's call their bluff. Let's start our own peace offensive and show the world how unitedly we Christians of America can stand together in this tremendous cause. What if our churches should suddenly march together, signifying that the brotherhood we hope to achieve in the world has been first achieved at home? These thoughts came to me as I stood in the offices of the Soviet Peace Committee. Here we were, each waiting for the dawn, each trying to convince the other that his country was the more ambitious for peace. A bit of wry American humor came to my mind, too. I could not help thinking, even while the secretary held my hands warmly in his, that it might not be long before we would again be shaking our fist at each other across the Atlantic. Such is the fallibility of man, and that, it seemed to me, more strongly than ever before, is why we so desperately need the help and grace of God. That was why I had to say, gentlemen, we'll never be able to do it alone.